everyone. Welcome to our information session on dealing with grief and loss, presented by Muscular Dystrophy Queensland. My name is Vicki Carrick. I'm a social worker here at MDQ, and I've got with me Sarah Shaw.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Shaw. I'm the chair of the Client Liaison Group who work with MDQ. I'm a client of MDQ and I live with muscular myopathy.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So together we're going to present this session for you on dealing with grief and loss. Before we get started, I wanted to do an acknowledgement to country, to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we're meeting. For me here in Meanjin in Brisbane, it's the Yugara and Turrbal people, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded, and reconciliation is a really important process for us as living all in Australia. So we're recording this session today on the back of an information session we presented, a live webinar we presented last week. And unfortunately, a number of people were unable to join us, so we've decided to record the session. So it'll be a shortened version of the session that we did, the same content, but Sarah and I will talk through parts of that session that we had in conversation with the participants at the live session. So we're going to talk through non-finite grief and loss and chronic sorrow. Sarah will share with you around self-identity and the impacts of, on chronic sorrow on self-identity and what makes up that self-identity. I'll talk through some grief and loss theories and models. It's not a comprehensive list of all the models and theories, but these are the couple that we think, really helpful theories to understand around grief and loss. And finally, Sarah and I will talk through together, different ways of coping with grief and loss, both from research and from lived experience. So non-finite grief and loss is different to finite grief and loss. So finite grief is most commonly known as bereavement, when there's a death of a loved one, is what's called a finite grief. Non-finite grief and loss is when the loss and grief is continuous and ongoing. And that's sometimes, or usually, around the loss of an imagined future and a sense of identity prior to self-diagnosis or pre-injury. So the loss is chronic. It can be chronic loss and sorrow, which we'll talk about, because there is that continuous nature of that, an ongoing nature of that loss. The loss prevents normal developmental expectations from being met in some parts of life. So when there's a diagnosis of muscular dystrophy, of a progressive neurological condition, that loss can impact on the developmental expectations of life. There's also the loss of functionality with degenerative conditions, and there are also additional intangible losses of expectations of the future around lifestyle, around work, around family. So that's what's called non-finite grief and loss, which we're focusing on this session today. Just touching on the difference with grief and loss and depression, not to go into a huge amount of detail, but that major depression and major depression disorder is a diagnosed condition. And for a diagnosed condition of depression, there needs to be 5 or more symptoms that have been present in a 2-week period. And at least one of those is a depressed mood or loss of interest. So it looks very similar to grief and loss. But just to know that if you're struggling with grief and loss and or think you may have some signs of depression, it's really important to get psychological support around that. Depressed mood can be described as sad, hopeless, discouraged, down in the dumps. It can also include increased irritability. And suicidal ideation is common, from not wanting to wake up in the morning to having a formed plan. So just important to be aware of grief and loss. There can be some diagnostic conditions around grief and loss when there's something called persistent complex bereavement disorder and prolonged grief disorder. So knowing that there can be a diagnosed condition, and what we're talking about today may cover some of that, but really is saying this is a normalized reaction to a chronic loss, to a non-finite grief and loss that may result in what we're talking about, which is chronic sorrow. So chronic sorrow is, this definition is from Susan Roos, who wrote a book around chronic sorrow in 2009, I think originally, and then she updated that in 2017. And she talks about chronic sorrow as a set of pervasive, profound, continuing and recurring grief responses resulting from a loss or absence of crucial aspects of oneself or another living person to whom there is a deep attachment. So chronic sorrow is an emotional reaction to non-finite loss. So the loss is the loss that will be experienced, and the reaction to that, the emotional reaction, is called chronic sorrow. It's a unique form of grieving that never ends. And in that, there's an acute awareness of the loss of a normal or expected future. And then the associated loss of, of hopes and dreams that you may have had with the future that was expected. So that's the definition of chronic sorrow, which we think is really helpful to understand when we're talking about living with a progressive condition. Some of the factors influencing chronic sorrow: developmental issues, healthcare, internal triggers, lifestyle. And we're going to go into this a little bit more when we talk about self-identity. So I'll hand over to Sarah.
Okay. So when we're talking about self-identity, we're really talking about what we value about ourselves, how we see ourselves, and what parts of ourselves we feel we're having to give up because of the progressive degenerative condition. And that can be formed by what you are known for, or what you value about yourself. So that can be things like, if you're a person who likes helping others, and that's something you've really valued about yourself and take great pride in, that can feel like it's being stripped away from you by the progressive condition. And everything that we do or come in contact has formed our sense of self-identity. So whether that's being involved in organised religion, taking note of how the political landscape talks about disability, our culture and how it interacts with disability, so someone from a culture where disability is very much integrated into the culture will have a very different point of view to disability than someone who's been brought up in a culture where disability is very much isolated and kept hidden or away from other people. So everything that we have been told in our lives will impact how we actually feel about ourselves, and what having a progressive illness that may result in some functional loss or disability, and how we feel about that. So, and one of the ways that we can look at that is, how do we feel about other disabled people? How have we viewed them? How have we interacted with them, etc.? So if you haven't had a lot to do with the disability space growing up, it can feel like a very foreign place to be in, and a very foreign world to have to learn, which is in itself, frightening and scary when you first land there. The other thing is to look at, some of the messaging in media and films, etc. There's a lot of films where disability, the only time it's represented is someone fighting back against it. So it's presented as a fight that you either win or lose, which can be impactful in how we think about disability, and not in a particularly positive way, in that you could be being sent messages that if you don't overcome this, if you're not the person who doctors say won't ever walk again, and you don't ever walk again, that you're somehow not got the heart or grit to actually overcome something that you were never going to overcome in the first place. So all of these things interact how we feel about disability and really need to be unpacked by yourself to exactly why you're feeling the way that you are.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. It prompts me to also, just add in terms of, political landscape. We won't get into a discussion around NDIS today, but certainly the messaging that comes through the big system that is geared to support people can often be one of the greatest challenges on self-identity, on how actually describing yourself and your condition and its impacts. Certainly that's something we've heard all the time at MDQ, is the impact of having to tell a story a certain way, and to not always want to believe that, because it's not what forms self-identity, but it's how I need to talk about my condition in order to get the support that I need.
Yeah. I mean, there's almost nothing in the big aspects of culture that help us deal with disability in a positive way. When you look at messaging from all of the institutions, whether that be the religions, the politics, even nationality.
Yeah, so true. Yeah, that could certainly be another whole session, I reckon, on that, because I think it's really would be very good to unpack that further. I'm just going to talk through a couple of theories and perspectives on grief and loss that might help to make sense of what you're experiencing. The first one is a really popular stage theory of grief, Kubler-Ross, the grief cycle, which most people are familiar with. You hear this language all the time around grief and loss. So there's the 5 stages of denial, anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance. This is not intended to be linear. So certainly Kubler-Ross would say you'll go in and out of different stages, but to get to the point of acceptance, there will need to be some experience of the other stages, whether they go in and out, or stay in one for a while. So this was originally proposed as a model of what's called anticipatory grief related to terminal illness, these 5 stages. And this has been taken to a whole range of different applications. It's appealing because it can bring a sense of order to what's a very complex process. However, I think it's important to know it's empirically unfounded. So there's not evidence that actually demonstrates these are the stages people go through. It can certainly, it has a very deficit focus. So all of those stages are very deficit around dealing with the loss and grief. And the danger can be that it can actually keep people in their grief if they don't work through that to acceptance. So it's a great model, and Sarah and I were talking about this in the workshop we did. It's a great model for experience. It's a great model to help understand the experience of dealing with a death of a loved one or a death. It's perhaps not as helpful for understanding a non-finite grief and loss process. However, it's good to talk about it and know that that's one way that you could you can make sense of how you might be feeling at different points of your life. The other model we want to talk about is the dual process model, which was originally developed in 1999. This dual process model, again, came out of research around dealing with bereavement and finite loss. However, this model can be, I think, much more easily translated to supporting, and understanding chronic grief and non-finite grief and loss. So, stroke talk about these dual processes of loss-orientated processes and restoration-orientated processes, and that there'll be an oscillation. They'll be going between these processes as people, navigate their grief and loss. So the sorts of things that would be a loss-orientated process, a bunch of those that are in that stage model that we just talked about, the grief work, intrusion of grief. It might be some denial or avoidance of wanting to move to acceptance and restoration. in the restoration orientated activities, it's acknowledging and accepting, you know, life's changes and attending to those. What might you be doing in order to, you know, to navigate this new reality that's happening? There might be some distraction from grief, whether that's purposeful or not purposeful. The next slide, sorry, has a bit more detail. So the loss orientated process, it's that, you know, the working through grief, processing emotions related to the grief, focusing on the losses, actually spending time, you know, sitting with that loss for yourself, for loved ones. It might look like some crying, yearning for a idolized person, talking about the loss, you know, spending time looking back over memories. And these processes are a really important part of the processing of the non-finite grief and loss. And then oscillating between the restoration orientated processes of, you know, that reorientation of a new world, focusing on activities that create new meaning and new relationships, and adjusting of family roles, you know, looking at what family looks like and what the roles are within the family. So sorts of things that can look like is some planning of new activities and linking with new appropriate supports, you know, navigating those systems to, you know, enable people to get the new supports that they need. So that's the dual process model of grief and loss. We're going to move on to talking about coping with grief and loss. Coping's a strong word. So really it's about you know, dealing with, navigating what, you know, what ways people can actually, you know, move through grief and loss. And we had a discussion in the session around what's worked for people and what hasn't worked. And certainly, you know, we can sort of recap that through the next couple of slides. But ultimately, it's a, you know, it's individual experience of what works and doesn't work, but certainly sharing that is really helpful. So I'll flick to the next slide, Sarah, if you want to talk through those points and maybe, you know, summarize some of the discussion that happened.
Yeah, so in the session we talked about having people acknowledge that the grief that you're feeling is normal, and not a big problem to be solved, how important that is. Often the disability support spaces actually isn't a great at this, because people go on and immediately people try to shut them down with, you know, blue sky thinking. You know, you have to be positive, and also talking about, you know, there's people much worse off than you with this condition. You know, you're just at the beginning parts of it. That doesn't particularly help. So finding people who will validate and normalise and understand your grief ongoing is really important. Hopefully that can be in peer support networks or with counsellors or friends, but finding someone to do that for you is really important. And keeping in mind that that's really important when you're in disability support spaces is also really important. That, you know, everyone's feelings are actually normal, and telling them that they shouldn't be feeling them or they don't have a right to feel them yet isn't particularly helpful. Being in spaces where you can actually discuss the realities of your condition, again, is very important. And it doesn't really particularly matter who that's with, but finding a space where you can actually tell people what you're going through and feeling heard and understood is important. Obviously, engaging therapeutic interventions, whether that be professional counselling or you know, any of the mainstream disability specific supports for dealing with your mental health. Seeking connection with others for two reasons. One is that you're getting the validation that you need, but also that can be a very important thing to do because it lets you out of your own head for a while. So in the discussion with the group the other night, seeking connection with others and actually listening to other people's issues and being that support for them can get you out of your own head, and be an important role in sort of not staying mired in your own grief. Skill building a sense of empowerment and control. So this is about learning to live with the change, and navigating into the future, which obviously is important, and learning how to live with the change. One of the things that got brought up here is we often don't overestimate the amount of time it actually going to take for you to actually learn to live with the change. And in fact, normalising change is relatively quick. It can be as little as sort of doing something 13 times for it to become the new normal. So taking the time to actually understand what the change is going to be like before you let yourself really go to full-on grief, and making informed decisions can be really helpful. Some of the things that may seem untenable or something that you absolutely wouldn't want to do or couldn't cope with may not be that dramatic or drastic once you've actually had to do it for a fortnight. And you can come out on the other side and think, well, that wasn't actually as bad as I thought it was going to be. Do you have any other things that you can remember from the session, Vicki?
Yeah, certainly, as you said, what stood out for me is the conversation we had around that giving back to others. People were saying, I often feel like I'm the recipient of other people's kind and caring, thoughtful gestures, but actually being able to give that back was really powerful. People saying, actually, being able to be the person, I may not be able to, take you to the shops and spend hours with you doing that, but I can have a cup of coffee with you. What can I do around, supporting other people? That seemed to be a really powerful message around that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
the other one sorry.
I guess the other one that sort of stood out universally was finding a sense of purpose, even if that's not a sense of purpose that other people particularly will validate for a whole bunch of reasons. We live in a capitalist society, etc. But finding something that has meaning for you, that gives you a sense of purpose, that's not about yourself in the world, that you can concentrate on, was something that sort of came across from multiple people.
I think within that, I think sometimes it can really help to have some structure around that. So I remember, a couple of people saying, I will do these things on a certain day of the week, or I will, have this put in my weekly to-do list, to actually kind of be those reminders of that sense of purpose. If I'm saying this is important, then can I actually commit to doing this in some way, shape, or form? I think seemed to be, that consistency, which is, really, a really important part of dealing with any grief and loss, is having some consistency and routine around life that, can allow that structure.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing is getting out of your own environment and getting into, whether that be your house, your room, your suburb, getting out into a new environment and actually experiencing other things. And I mean, which can be hard and daunting, but is usually worth it if you put in the effort, is something that people tend to use.
Yeah, for sure. And it lends itself, if it's okay, Sarah, to move to, we're touching on this one around, moods and hormones, and sometimes that, knowing that actually there are hormones that can really impact on mood. And I think everyone sort of knows that, but thinking, what are those hormones? And sometimes, people need support to get hold of those hormones, if that's through having different medications. But the sorts of things Sarah was talking about, by going outside and walking in nature, boosting the serotonin can be an example of what's actually happening in your body. They call serotonin the mood stabilizer, oxytocin, the love hormone, so physical affection, acts of kindness, that giving back, interacting with pets, endorphins, natural painkillers. So that might be some sort of movement, laughter, creating art, and then dopamine, which is, getting that sense of achievement from perhaps completing a task or learning a new skill, looking after yourself, some self-care. So, there's some really, quite simple things, like just the act of going inside to outside, getting some sun, looking at nature, resting your eyes, on a different landscape can be those mood enhancers as well. Did you want to touch on that at all, Sarah? Anything else?
No, I mean, it works. There's a reason why they're the prescriptions for depression and grief, and that's because it works. So, the only other ones I would say is live entertainment in any form is a good endorphin and serotonin mood lifter, even if, it doesn't have to be an expensive show at QPAC at your local pub, putting on live music, but it works at getting your mood lift.
And actually, that was a great discussion we had at that session last week, when people were talking about, I think it was going to QPAC, and one of the participants said, I can't go to QPAC because the accessibility is so, well, no, I think they did go to QPAC, but the ability was really tricky. And then I think it was Sarah was, explaining there is an accessible lift at a certain part of the car park if you get there. So I think even being able to know that information, so who can you connect with to find out what venues are accessible and what, other people have got on and enjoyed, I think that's what that reminded me of as well. You might think something is actually not possible. If you can connect in with other people's experience, it might well be very possible.
Yeah.
So that's the end of our content. We can't obviously do questions and comments in this forum, but before I have got a list of references as the last slide, so certainly you can access that when you, if you want to find out any more information. But just in terms of this, presentation of the material, very happy, to receive any feedback from anyone that's, watching this online or virtual, any other information or resources that would be helpful. Please reach out to MDQ and let us know. Before we finish up, Sarah, is there any final comments you wanted to make?
No. Probably one of the best analogies that I've ever read was from Julie Jones of Have Wheelchair Will Travel, and she says she got it from someone but doesn't know who. And that is that, being diagnosed with one of these conditions is like being on a trip where you thought you were going to Italy, you'd studied the language, you were looking forward to the food and the sights and the history, etc. And you land in a completely foreign country where you don't know the language, you have no idea of the history, and you don't particularly like the food, and you've been told by everybody you've ever met that it's the worst place you could ever possibly end up on the planet. But over time you realise that a lot of that's a furphy. You will learn to navigate your way through, despite not knowing anything about it, and that it's will certainly have its challenges, but you will learn to be comfortable there in a shorter period of time than you thought it would take.
Yeah, thank you. It's really powerful, isn't it? And Sarah and I are working together with one of our OTs on an article around grief and loss that we also featured on the website. So if you haven't seen that already, go across and have a look at that article where there's some more resources, information shared as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Vicki.
Thanks, Sarah. Bye-bye.